Are there any Russians in Davos? Are there any, I know there's not a Russia house or anything. Are there any advocates or activists for Russia here?
No, of course not. Russian are forbidden here.
Okay, when you say of course not, have they been banned or something, or they just don't show up?
As you know that. Okay, I'm sorry, because Russians are not welcome here.
Ezra Levant here on the streets of Davos, Switzerland. This is the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, which is a unique blend of big business, big media, and big government. Well, one of the biggest governments in the world these days, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer, Canadian taxpayer, British taxpayer, is the government of Ukraine, which is in an existential battle against the Russian Federation. I say it's an existential battle because, of course, Russia seeks to annex certain regions of Ukraine that Russia claims are ethnically Russian and that Russia claims are being punished, being persecuted by the Kiev-based government that has a different history. I mean, Ukraine's borders have changed over the years. There's different ethnicities, and it's quite a brutal battle. It's not the first time Russia has invaded Ukraine. They did it in 2014, but this time NATO, and in particular the United States, has flooded the zone with money and with weapons, and it's turned into a brutal, long-running battle that I'm sure has caught Vladimir Putin by surprise. Makes me nervous, the whole thing, because, of course, both sides have nuclear weapons, and I don't know if you could ever have a total victory over a foe that has nuclear weapons, especially Vladimir Putin with the imperialistic pride that he wields. That's a background. You already know that, but here I am at the massive Ukraine pavilion. Now, as I've showed you by walking these streets before, there are other countries here and other states of countries, for example in India, that are promoting themselves. We walked by the Malaysian government pavilion, and I have to say, no disrespect to Malaysia, but I'm just not interested. I'm not interested in investing there. I'm not that politically interested in Malaysia, but I'm extremely interested in Ukraine because I'm worried about the war. I don't understand the Western role in it, including enormous amounts of money. I don't understand the focus on fighting to the end as opposed to some sort of negotiated settlement, and I don't think that makes me either a peacenik or a collaborator. No one less than Henry Kissinger himself, the mighty global diplomatic strategist, says there has to be some sort of negotiated outcome here. What do I know compared to him? So I approached this pavilion with a little bit of political skepticism. Now, to my delight, they were happy to have us in there, and our cameras too. I suppose that they are in the PR business as opposed to the secret deals business that a lot of Davos is. So I want to take you through this facility. I didn't go to every nook and cranny of it, but the main floor is a kind of museum that frankly reminded me a little bit of the Holocaust Museum in that it was documenting death and destruction and injury to civilians. And they use the language of war crimes, and they certainly use dramatic footage, both video footage and photography. Here, let me show you my conversation with three different people. I'll start off with one young lad who was just happy to have us there. And as we talk with him, we'll show you some of the imagery that was shown.
Yes, hello everyone, my name is Levant. I'm from Ukraine, and this is two projects, Ukraine is You and Ukraine House Davos. It's dedicated to show that Ukraine role in the world, to show the Russian crimes in Ukraine, to reveal Russian crimes to the world. This is the main point of today's meeting, and we're happy for hosting us within the framework of World Economic Forum.
So is the president of Ukraine making a presentation either in person or by video link?
Yes, president don't leave the country because of exception was like a visit to Washington DC, and he is addressing the guests by the video. It will be, and the head of the office president had an address to the guests, and also First Lady of Ukraine was there yesterday.
Oh, she was here in person?
Yes, and also some very distinguished guests visited our panels yesterday. President Duda, President of Latvia, and ex-president of Estonia, and a lot of other our friends.
Now, do you take a particular ideological view here, or are you sort of just pro-Ukraine? Like, for example, do you talk about negotiations with Russia? Do you talk about Kissinger's point of view of perhaps a managed settlement? Or do you get into details like that, or is it more high level?
We're promoting Ukrainian position to the world. We want to Ukraine be louder, the Ukrainian voice to be louder. We want to show everyone in the world the crimes Russia has committed in Ukraine. That's very important for us.
Are there any Russians in Davos? Are there any, I know there's not a Russia house or anything. Are there any advocates or activists for Russia here?
No, of course not. Russian are forbidden here.
Okay, when you say of course not, have they been banned or something, or they just don't show up?
As you know that, okay, I'm sorry, because Russians are not welcome here.
Well, that young lad wasn't really supposed to talk to us, so they brought in the artistic director, who is a very grave man, as you can imagine, the things he's seen, and he told us a little bit more about the purpose of this pavilion. I was just trying to understand this installation and its meaning and its purpose, and I'm guessing you're the guy to talk to.
What we did is when Kherson got liberated, we went there with two Ukrainian artists, Roman Himei and Yarema Malashuk, and we asked them to make a portrait of what it meant to be liberated after 9 months of very brutal occupation. And this is what we are trying to show. We are trying to show not only the joy that people underwent after the liberation, but equally the dignity of the Ukrainians after being subjected to many atrocities, and unfortunately also some of the witness statements of those people who were put in makeshift prisons by Russian forces.
So the language you're using sounds to me like the language of war crimes. Is that accurate?
Well, war crimes are happening across the territory, across the occupied territories in Ukraine. And this is one part of the exhibition, which is upstairs, where we again have to focus on the war crimes that have not stopped.
Is it one of the goals of this installation to get war crimes prosecutions of Russia?
It's absolutely essential that justice will be brought against those who committed the atrocities. So yes, one wants to have justice, and it's not the goal of the installation. The goal of the installation is to create awareness, to create emotions, but I hope part of the discussions that we're holding around this installation is really focused on how to get Russian war criminals to justice.
Now, I spoke to one of your colleagues earlier and I said, is there a Russian presence in Davos? And he said no. Is that an official position of the World Economic Forum, or is that just they have chosen not to come, or have they been banned? Has anyone presented from the Russian side?
That's something you have to ask the World Economic Forum, but as far as I know, the Russian side is disinvited from the World Economic Forum.
Well, they really were interested in a legal political solution, but not a negotiated peace, but rather a prosecution, maybe even Nuremberg style. We went upstairs, and wouldn't you know it, they were about to have a lawyers' panel discussion on that very subject, on prosecuting Russians for war crimes, and actually on reparations, which is an interesting idea, which is not often done. Germany paid reparations after the First War, the Treaty of Versailles, but I think it sowed the seeds of the Second War. Believe it or not, Germany actually still pays reparations for the Holocaust to the State of Israel. I talked to one of the lawyers who was about to go on the panel. I told him I didn't have time to stay for the whole thing, but could he give me a summary? And I would like to play for you now the totality of my interview with an international human rights lawyer, I'll call him, who made the case to me that Russia and Russians should not only be prosecuted for war crimes, but they should also be made to pay reparations to rebuild Ukraine. I'll let that interview run in full. I thought it was very interesting. Are you from the United States?
Well, originally, but I live in the United Kingdom. I'm an international lawyer at the Lauterbach Center for International Law at the University of Cambridge.
It was and I see you're about to begin a panel. On the screen it says, Holding Russia Accountable, Roadmap for Reparations for Ukraine. I imagine you're speaking to that.
That's the subject of the panel.
And what's the theory? Is there a legal theory that there are war crimes being committed and that they ought to be prosecuted?
Well, there are a couple different issues. First of all, there's the issue of criminal responsibility, which the previous panel addressed in some detail and talked about different institutional approaches that might be taken to make sure that individuals, including the head of state and head of government of Russia, are held accountable at a criminal level. There's also what under national law you might think of as civil liability. International lawyers talk about state responsibility outside the criminal law. In other words, when one country commits such crimes of the magnitude that Russia has committed, there are physical, moral, human, financial damages to the country that they've attacked. And in case of Russia attacking Ukraine, there are absolutely enormous harms at the human level and also at the national economic level. So the reparations discussion aims to find pathways, procedural and institutional pathways, to hold Russia to account in that sense, in terms of making sure it's Russia that pays for the damage that Russia has done.
Can I ask you about the concept of sovereign immunity? I mean, wars happen, unfortunately, all the time. And there's never been a war without civilian casualties. It's one of the horrors of war. Does the concept of sovereign immunity and basically the history of warfare preclude a legal solution? And really, may I suggest that any conclusion will likely have to be negotiated politically with Russia? What would you say to that counterpoint? Tell me if I'm wrong, tell me if I'm right.
I think in an ordinary situation, even a ordinary bad situation, the end point is usually some type of negotiated settlement. The thing is, this isn't an ordinary situation. Since 1945, with the possible exception of Saddam Hussein's Iraq invading and attempting to destroy Kuwait, there's been nothing remotely like this. And since 1945, the world, including the world economy, have benefited enormously from the consensus that one country shall not use force to change the boundaries of another country. You don't do that under the modern settlement that we reached after 1945. Took a long time to get there.
But Iran, Iraq, Morocco, Algeria, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. I mean, I could, at least just off the top of my head, I could probably name, Vietnam, Korea. I mean, since 1945, there's probably been 100 wars that change boundaries. I mean, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm just trying to understand how this is legally different, and I'm looking forward to your answer.
You're actually wrong. There's been nothing remotely like this, with the possible exception of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. An established boundary, a settled boundary, challenged by force, with a declared, under the law of the aggressor, a declared annexation. This is Hitler stuff. We haven't seen that.
You've been very generous with your time. I have one last question, and it's about reparations. Can you tell me one possible scenario? How would that look? Because that seems so contrary to the national pride and the psychology of Vladimir Putin. I'm having trouble even conceiving of it. And when I think of reparations in the Weimar Republic, I felt like, I think it's conventional wisdom that it sowed the seeds of further discord. Give me your scenario, your vision of what a reparations solution looks like.
Well, one difference is that the Weimar Republic was a country that did not inherit an enormous integrated economy with the world. We, over the last 30 years, gave Russia every benefit of the doubt and permitted it to participate as a full participant in the world economy. For that reason, Russia has enormous assets invested overseas. A lot of those assets are ostensibly private assets that were stolen by ostensibly private individuals, as well as people with very tight connections to the regime, and placed overseas. A great deal can be done for Ukraine and to establish accountability by taking the assets that were either stolen or otherwise moved out of Russia. That's quite different from Germany, where after World War I, what happened was Germany was placed under an ongoing, very long-term obligation to give money out of present accounts that were at a level that really wasn't sustainable by the German economy. And these actually were envisaged to go on into the 1980s or 90s. With Russia, if you look at just the central bank assets that are already frozen, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's not even getting into the private assets.
It looks like you've got to get on stage. Give me 30 seconds. I come from Canada. We have lots of natural gas. Some Canadians would like to sell that natural gas to Europe to displace Russian conflict energy. Do you have an opinion on that?
I think a worldwide natural gas market's a great thing because we should not be buying gas from Russia.
I would call that conflict energy versus Western ethical energy. What do you think of that terminology?
That's actually quite good terminology. You're the first person I've heard to use it. I congratulate you.
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical. He says that there is no war like this Russia-Ukraine war since Hitler. In fact, he did invoke Hitler. I think that's overheated rhetoric, but listen, if you and your community have been killed and injured, obviously you reach for emotionally powerful language. And I have to tell you, I came in here, I remain a skeptic of the president of Ukraine. I remain a skeptic of the Western policy of shoveling tens of billions of dollars, almost $100 billion in the case of the United States, many billions of dollars from Canada. I remain a skeptic of unlimited cash to fuel a war as opposed to efforts to resolve a war through negotiation and diplomacy. I say this because I am genuinely worried that this war could turn into a larger conflagration. I do not think it's a good idea for NATO to be fighting with a nuclear power. I'm sorry you called me old-fashioned, but I think that was the general view until a year ago. I will say, though, that looking at the gruesome and heartbreaking imagery of the injuries does have an emotional effect on someone. And I do most certainly sympathize with everyone I met in there, especially the artistic director, who was clearly being psychologically and emotionally troubled deeply by what he's seen. I don't think it is likely that Russia will ever pay compensation or reparations to Ukraine. I just don't think so. And by the way, where would that end? Those areas have been going back and forth for centuries. It's almost like the map of the Middle East, countries conquering countries, and I don't support it. I'm just saying that the idea of extracting billions or tens or hundreds of billions of dollars from Russia is so unlikely. It would not only require a, quote, regime change to get rid of Vladimir Putin, but I just don't think it's possible. But perhaps the purpose of this installation is to emotionally remind people about the terrible civilian cost of war and to plant radical ideas like war crimes prosecutions and reparations, to move the Overton window, to have that conversation that may be radical and unlikely to make other conversations more likely. For example, I showed you the other day that BlackRock, the $10 trillion asset manager, is already talking about rebuilding Ukraine after the war. I should also say that BlackRock invests in the military weapons manufacturers that are fighting the war. So perhaps the reparations wouldn't come so much from Russia, but maybe they would come from the West, from Joe Biden, from Rishi Sunak, from Chrystia Freeland, who I understand is visiting tomorrow. So the reparations, I'm afraid, probably will not come from Vladimir Putin. I think he would rather die and nuke the world before paying reparations. But maybe the reparations will come from you and me. I leave with a sympathy for the Ukrainian people. You can't look at that carnage and bloodshed without feeling a deep sympathy. I think skeptics would say any war has a tremendous tragedy, and they would say there's an ethnocentrism for caring more about white European civilian victims than against, say, Muslim Arab civilian victims in the Yemen war, for example. There's countless wars. He was trying to make a moral comparison between what's happening in Ukraine now and the Holocaust, frankly. I'm not sure if that moral comparison holds up, but who am I to say a death is not tragic, whether it's a Ukrainian death or a Yemeni death? It's a powerful pavilion, and I have to say it impacted me emotionally more than I thought it would. But even though I feel some sorrow in my heart for what I saw, and I'm glad I live in peaceful Canada rather than actually Dnipro, Ukraine, where my great-grandfather came in 1903. I'm very glad my family no longer lives in Ukraine. I'm very glad I live in peaceful Canada, and my heart goes out to those who have been killed and injured. That emotional reaction I have to this artistic installation is not enough to make me say, yes, let's have total war and go for regime change in Russia. It simply doesn't make sense to me. And that's my take on it. But I'm very glad I went in there, and I was very glad for their hospitality. I'd love your thoughts on this, because this is such a controversial issue. And Rebel News has not really gone deep into it because it's a war. And our view is this war is terrible. And I'd like to know what you think. Send me an email to Ezra at rebelnews.com. Just an interesting little visit, one I didn't expect. To see all our little videos from here in Davos at the World Economic Forum, go to WEFreports.com. I'm on the streets of Davos, Switzerland. This is the annual get-together of the World Economic Forum. Along these streets, you'll find different VIPs and different presentation pavilions. Today, I went into the one by the state of Ukraine. There's also companies and various lobby groups. We'll keep you posted about what we see and hear and who we meet. Go to WEFreports.com for all our coverage.